Before the city learned her name, before money moved without signatures and doors opened without knocks, there was a night that refused to stay buried, a night that waited patiently, like a debt with interest. Some stories don't begin with power or blood, but with a single choice made by someone who thought it would never matter. If you find yourself drawn to stories about fate, consequence, and the unseen threads that bind strangers together, go ahead and like and subscribe now. You'll want to stay with this one. I tell this story because I was there the night everything circled back, and because I watched a woman learn that kindness, once given, never really disappears. It just waits. It began on a rain-heavy evening when the city smelled of rust and wet concrete, when headlights smeared across asphalt like oil paint, and when a woman named Mara Vale stood in a narrow bank office clutching a folder that held the sum total of her failures and bad luck. The numbers inside that folder were cruel in their neatness. Student loans she never finished paying, medical bills from her father's last year, interest stacked on interest until the debt felt less like money and more like a sentence. And I remember the way her shoulders were set, not in defeat but in endurance, as if she had long ago accepted that survival meant carrying weight no one else could see. The banker was mid-sentence, reciting options that weren't really options, when the temperature in the room changed, not literally, but in the way animals know when a predator enters the clearing, and I felt it before I saw him. The subtle pause in breath, the shift in posture, the instinctive straightening of spines. As a man stepped into the doorway with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been told no in any room that mattered. He wasn't flashy, no rings, no visible weapons, just a tailored coat, dark eyes, and a stillness that made noise irrelevant. And when he spoke, "I'll take care of it," the words didn't rise, they settled, like final stones on a grave. Mara turned, confusion breaking through her practiced calm, and said she didn't understand, that there must be a mistake, but the banker was already nodding, hands trembling as if eager to comply with gravity itself, and I watched as figures were adjusted, screens refreshed, debts erased with a few quiet keystrokes that carried more power than 100 protests. When it was done, the man looked at Mara not like a benefactor seeking gratitude, but like someone checking a reflection for accuracy, and he said, almost gently, that she wouldn't remember him. Not really. And that was when the past, long dormant, opened its eyes. Years earlier, on a different kind of night, one soaked not just with rain but with panic, Mara had been walking home from a double shift when she heard a sound that didn't belong. Metal on bone, a breath that came out wrong, and she had turned into an alley she should have avoided, found a man bleeding into trash and shadow, and despite every sensible instinct screaming at her to run, she hadn't. She'd pressed her scarf into the wound, ignored his slurred insistence that she leave, stayed until sirens cut through the dark, and then vanished before anyone could ask her name. Because for her it wasn't heroism, it was reflex. What she never knew was that the man she saved was Luca Moretti, and what the city whispered about him later, king, butcher, strategist, was all true, but incomplete, because none of those names accounted for the fact that he was alive solely because one woman chose not to look away. When Luca finally found her years later, after climbing from that alley to the top of an empire built on leverage and loyalty, he didn't see a debtor to reward. He saw an equation that had finally balanced, and paying off her debts was not generosity, it was math. What Mara didn't understand at first was that money was the smallest part of what had been set in motion, because protection followed payment the way thunder follows lightning. And suddenly the street outside her apartment was quieter. The landlord stopped calling. The man who used to linger too long at the corner cafe found other places to be, and all of it felt wrong, like living inside a gift you never asked for. I watched her try to return the favor, to insist she didn't want it, didn't need it, and I watched Luca listen without interrupting, his face unreadable, until he said the sentence that would change the shape of her life, that some debts cannot be refused, only honored. She asked him why now, why after all these years, and he told her that power teaches patience, that he had waited until he could repay her without putting her in danger, a statement that was both promise and warning, because danger, once acknowledged, has a way of stepping closer. Even as part 1 closes, I can tell you this much. The city did not take kindly to Luca's sudden very public act of loyalty to a woman with no known value to his world. And eyes began to turn, questions to form, because in a place ruled by fear, mercy looks like a crack in the wall, and cracks invite pressure. Mara thought the story was about a debt being erased, but I knew, watching from the edges, that it was really about one being transferred, because saving a life is never free. And by the end of that night, long before she understood the rules of the game she had entered years ago without knowing it, Mara Vale had become the most protected and most dangerous kind of person in Luca Moretti's world, someone he owed. By the time Mara understood that the debt had not vanished but merely changed shape, the city had already begun to adjust around her, the way it always does when something powerful shifts beneath its surface. I saw it first in the small things, how her name stopped appearing on overdue notices, how her phone stopped ringing with unknown numbers, how the cafe owner down the block began greeting her with a careful politeness that bordered on reverence. And I knew then that Luca Moretti's intervention had done what it always did. It had created gravity. Mara tried to pretend otherwise. She told herself it was coincidence, that luck had finally turned, that the world sometimes corrected itself without demanding payment. But I watched the way she checked over her shoulder now, the way her steps quickened at dusk, the way she studied faces instead of passing them. And those were not the habits of someone who believed in coincidence. Those were the instincts of someone who felt eyes on her even when she couldn't see them. Luca, for his part, remained distant but present, like a shadow cast from a building too tall to look up at directly. And when he finally invited her to meet again, it wasn't with a demand but with an assurance. Neutral ground, public space, daylight, because for all his power, he understood fear, and he knew hers was not unfounded. They met in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river, the kind of place where conversations dissolved into ambient sound, and as I watched from across the room, I saw how carefully he chose his words, how he framed the truth without softening it, telling her that paying her debts had been necessary but insufficient, that the men who watched his moves would read meaning into everything, especially kindness, and that by acting openly, he had marked her whether he wanted to or not. Mara didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse him, but I could hear the steel beneath her calm when she asked why she hadn't been given a choice. And Luca's answer was simple and terrible in its honesty, because the choice had been made years ago in an alley that smelled like blood and rain, and whether either of them liked it no longer mattered. The city, he explained, did not believe in selflessness. It believed in leverage. And the moment word spread that Luca Moretti had erased a stranger's debts without asking for anything in return, others would come looking for the reason. Because in his world, mercy was either weakness or strategy, and both attracted predators. The first test came sooner than expected. A man named Rizzo, small-time by Luca's standards but ambitious enough to be dangerous, approached Mara outside her building one evening with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, offering help she hadn't asked for, implying knowledge he shouldn't have had, and I remember the way her hand shook as she refused him, the way she walked faster without running, and the way Rizzo's smile thinned into something sharper as he watched her go. Luca dealt with it quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. But the message traveled faster than the action itself ever could, and soon everyone knew that Mara Vale was not to be touched, questioned, or leveraged, not because she was powerful, but because she mattered to someone who was. That distinction made her more dangerous than money ever could. Mara hated it. She hated the silence that followed her, the invisible wall that kept strangers at a respectful distance, the way people's tones changed once they realized who she was adjacent to. And she told Luca as much the next time they spoke, accusing him of turning her into a symbol she never agreed to be. He listened, as he always did, and then he told her something that made the room feel smaller. That symbols were safer than civilians, because symbols had rules, and rules could be enforced. The truth was that Luca was trying to protect her not just from his enemies, but from his allies, because loyalty in his world was transactional, and anyone who saw Mara as a potential weakness might also see her as an opportunity. To counter that, Luca did something unexpected. He gave her agency. He didn't offer her a role or a title, but he explained the landscape, introduced her to the idea that information was currency, that attention could be redirected, that simply being present in certain rooms could change outcomes. And I watched Mara absorb this not with fear, but with the same quiet resolve that had carried her into that alley years ago. She asked questions. She listened. She learned. Not because she wanted power, but because she wanted survival on her own terms. The more she understood, the more dangerous she became, not to Luca, but to those who underestimated her. And that, I think, was when he began to trust her, not as a liability to shield, but as a variable to respect. Yet trust did not erase danger. Whispers spread. Rivals speculated. One rumor claimed she was leverage, another insisted she was insurance, a third suggested she was something worse, a conscience, and that rumor unsettled people the most, because conscience has a way of interfering with profit. I saw how Luca watched her during those weeks, measuring not just threats, but outcomes, and I saw how Mara began to push back in small ways, asking him why certain people were targeted, why certain decisions were necessary, why some lines were crossed while others remained sacred. And though he never justified himself fully, he answered enough to reveal that the empire he ran was not as monolithic as it appeared, that it was built on compromises layered so thick they felt like inevitability. Part 2 ends with a moment that seemed insignificant at the time, but wasn't. A late-night call, a single name spoken too carefully, a pause that lingered too long. Someone was planning to test Luca again, not through force, but through choice, and Mara, whether she wanted it or not, was about to discover that the greatest danger in a world like his isn't violence. It's being the reason someone hesitates. The night everything came to a head was quieter than it had any right to be, the kind of calm that settles over a city just before it decides what it's willing to become, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that perhaps this time the storm would pass without breaking anything important. It didn't. The test Luca had anticipated came not with guns or threats, but with an offer, delivered through channels so polite they felt almost civilized. Give them Mara, or at least step aside, and let them speak to her alone, and in return the pressure on his borders would ease, the whispers would stop, and the fragile balance he'd maintained for years would remain intact. It was a clever move, because it framed betrayal as pragmatism, and I watched Luca sit with that choice longer than I had ever seen. Him sit with anything, his silence heavier than anger, because for the first time since that alley, the debt he owed couldn't be paid with money or blood. It required a decision that would define him. Mara, of course, found out anyway. She always did. She came to him not with panic, but with clarity, saying she understood the logic, that she had never asked to be protected, and that if removing herself would keep others safe, she would do it. And in that moment I realized something Luca already knew, that the woman who once refused to leave a dying stranger was not someone who could be moved like a chess piece, even now. He told her no, and not gently, because gentleness would have sounded like doubt, and he explained that handing her over would not restore balance, it would destroy it, because the moment he proved that loyalty had limits, everything he built would collapse inward. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive, not because Luca was ruthless, though he was, but because he was certain, and certainty, in his world, ends arguments before they begin. The message went out, clean and final, that Mara Vale was untouchable, not as leverage, not as a bargaining chip, not now or ever, and the cost of challenging that decree would exceed any potential gain. There were consequences, of course, there are always consequences, but they were the kind Luca knew how to manage, the kind that could be absorbed, redirected, outlasted. What surprised everyone, including me, was what came after. Luca didn't tighten his grip. He loosened it. He delegated more, withdrew from certain operations, dismantled a few structures that had outlived their usefulness, and when asked why, he said only that an empire maintained solely by fear eventually collapses under its own weight. Mara never became part of the business, not formally, but her presence altered it anyway, a constant reminder that power could owe something to decency without becoming weak, and I watched hardened men lower their voices around her, reconsider choices they would have made automatically before, because once you know someone is watching, not with judgment, but with memory, you hesitate. In the end, there was no dramatic farewell, no escape to another city, no clean severing of ties. Mara stayed, not because she was trapped, but because she chose to, carving out a life that existed alongside Luca's world without being consumed by it, and Luca let her. which may have been the most dangerous thing he ever did. Years later, people still tell the story wrong. They say the Mafia king paid off a stranger's debts out of sentiment, or guilt, or romance, because those explanations are easier than the truth. The truth is that a life was saved once, freely, without witnesses, and when that life became powerful, it remembered. I tell this story because I saw how a single act of kindness bent the trajectory of an empire, and because I want it known that not all debts are chains, some are anchors, keeping us from drifting too far from who we were before the world taught us better.